Today we're going to talk about my 5 essential tips for preparing for a landscape photography workshop. So today I thought I would share some of the things I share with workshop attendees that are going to be coming to one of my workshops. These are things you can do to just be a little more prepared in order to get the most out of a workshop. Now these tips are sort of tailored to my workshops and things I like to see and things I've learned over time. But with that said, if you're going to another landscape photographer's workshop and you're just looking for some general prep tips, I think these tips will all be very relevant and will help you get the most out of the workshop. Now, landscape photography workshops are a great way to immerse yourself in landscape photography. I've talked about why I go to workshops in the past. I'll link to that video down below. But they're really just a great way to immerse yourself in landscape photography. You get to get some dedicated time to focus on using your camera, and you've got someone right there to help you answer questions, give you real-time feedback, and everything like that. It can just be a really great experience. It can be a great way to meet and collaborate with others. And even if you're an experienced landscape photographer, a workshop a lot of times can give you an efficient way to go see some amazing sites. And again, even if you're experienced, sometimes just having that sounding board, that someone to ask, hey, would you do it this way? Would you do it this way? Or what do you think of this? Can be super handy. But to make the most of your time at a workshop, if you just do a little bit of preparation ahead of time, you can make sure you get all the value out of it that you should. So first up is camera preparation for a workshop. Now, depending on skill set level, you may be coming to the workshop and really trying to get a firm grasp of how the exposure triangle works, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and everything like that. Maybe you're more experienced and you've got that well in hand and you've already sort of got your camera mastered. But let's assume you're sort of a beginner or at that intermediate stage. There are some things that you can do with the camera to just sort of make sure you're ready to go. Now, I get it. You're trying to figure out how the exposure triangle works, but it doesn't hurt to take some time to make sure you understand how to get your camera in manual mode. I tend to teach, at least on a workshop, how to use manual mode. We'll talk about the other modes, aperture priority, but at least know how to get into manual mode on your camera. And then once you're in manual mode, what dials and buttons do you need to change in order to change shutter speed, ISO, and aperture? Knowing how to do that with your camera can just maximize the value of the time you'll have out in the field, because you can focus more on the why you're changing shutter speed, why you're changing aperture, what to do with ISO, instead of trying to figure out exactly where that is at on your camera. These are things you can do in the comfort of your home. Take a look at YouTube, search your camera model and manual mode, and it'll sort of walk you through where things are at. You can look at your camera's instruction manual, anything like that. But if you can have that prepared ahead of time so that you can do the basic manipulations of your camera, that's just going to make your workshop experience a little better. It's fine if you don't understand why do I want to change my shutter speed or why do I want to change my aperture. We'll cover that at the workshop, but knowing where to change it is super helpful. Another handy thing to know about your camera is how to enable the self-timer. If you're photographing from a tripod for those long exposures, it's nice to be able to just sort of set the self-timer to something like 2 seconds. That way you press the shutter, let go, and your camera sort of has a second or two to settle down before it takes the picture to help keep things nice and sharp. So knowing how to switch between having the self-timer enabled or an exposure delay option enabled and just clicking the shutter and the shutter releasing is handy and will help us out in the field. We can always look it up in the field, we can always figure it out, but in order to maximize your time and again get the value where it's really important, knowing how to do that can be good. The other thing I always recommend to my workshop attendees is to photograph in RAW, especially if it's a multi-day workshop. We'll be working with photos in the editing software, so it's a great opportunity to take a RAW file and work on it in editing in case you're new to RAW files. If you're nervous about that because you've always shot JPEG, or you're nervous about doing editing and like not being able to save a file or get a RAW image to look the way you want, by all means configure your camera to shoot in RAW plus JPEG. That way you're safe. The camera's going to take a picture, you're going to have the JPEG that you might be used to, but we've got the RAW file to play with and experiment with, and you can see how powerful it is. So I always recommend RAW or RAW plus JPEG mode. And another thing I like people to do is make sure they have their histogram enabled so that we can really go over and master those exposure fundamentals. The histogram is a key piece to that. It's one of the things that really started to change my landscape photography from the technical confidence perspective. So that's what I tend to teach people out in the field. Now we'll talk about the light meter, which is pretty much always visible in the camera, how it works, but we'll take that into why the histogram is a little better in my opinion and how it works and everything like that. Not all cameras will have it enabled by default, so I always recommend taking a look, making sure you know how to enable your histogram before you show up to the workshop. That way, that'll be there, and I know it's something I always teach and always go over, so make sure you know how to have your histogram enabled. And finally, my last little tip is go find your camera manual and download it to your phone. That way, if we're out in the field and we touch on something, say you forgot to enable the histogram, If I don't know how to do it off the top of my head or by browsing through your menus, we can pop the camera manual up on your phone, because we might be in a place that doesn't have internet connectivity, and figure out how to enable that histogram. Super handy. Now for my workshops, I tend to ask everybody, what kind of camera are you bringing to the workshop? And I try to go out and download each individual camera manual to my iPad, so that if we're without internet or anything like that, I'll have my iPad with me and we can look it up. So if I'm ever in a situation where I don't know quite how to configure something on your camera because it's something I haven't used a lot or a different menu system, I still have the manual along to help, but you can also download the manual to your phone and it's super handy. Next up, we've got bringing the right gear with you. In this section, we're going to talk about camera gear and related items that you might want to bring. Now, this can vary depending on people. You might be brand new and you might have one camera and one lens and that's it. And that's perfectly fine. Bring what you have. But then there's others of us that have multiple camera bodies. We have 6, 7 lenses to choose from. We've got 2 different tripods, different sets of filters. But there is an element of trying to find just the right amount of gear to bring with you. Not too much so that you're struggling to carry it around and maneuver it around, but enough gear that you have flexible options. Now, at a minimum, I do recommend obviously a camera body, at least one lens. My ideal recommendation is a wide angle lens, a standard zoom lens, and a telephoto lens. That sort of lets you cover all sorts of different ones. Like I said, a lot of people won't have the telephoto lens, so we're just going to shoot a wide in like a 24-70 or a 24-105, and that's totally fine. We will work with what you have. If you have all three to cover that full wide, mid, and telephoto, then bring it. It's handy to have. I always recommend a tripod. A lot of my workshops involve waterfalls, moving water, long exposures, so having a tripod is super handy. That is one of those things that might be worth going out and purchasing and bringing it, just so we can maximize the things you can learn at a workshop and get the most for your time. And of course, beyond the tripod, we've got, make sure you bring a memory card that has plenty of space on it, bring a battery, bring a charger, and make sure you have a camera bag so that we can carry all this equipment from point A to point B. Those are my basics. Again, maybe you'll have 2 camera bodies, maybe you'll have 3 lenses, maybe you'll be 1 camera body, 1 lens. But those are the basics, and that's sort of what we're looking for. Now, beyond that, filters are super handy. If you have a circular polarizing filter, that's the first filter I always recommend to get. They're super handy. You know, bring one of those to the workshop. If you have some ND filters, bring those. Also super handy, and we can talk about how to use them and get good effects with them out in the field. If you don't have them, it's okay, but it is something that if you're looking to really maximize, you might want to at least get a CPL filter, circular polarizing filter, for while we're out there, but not absolutely required. That's just sort of a nice to have. And then, like I said, cleaning gear is good, especially if we're out in some rain or anything like that. A microfiber cloth to keep that front lens element dry, and anything if you have to get some dirt on your sensor, we can do a quick, rocket blower or something like that. Just sort of nice to have. Some of those things are things I would have with me anyways, and so I can help share and we can get you taken care of. But just some extras that are nice to have. Now, on multi-day workshops, this is where we start to get into, if you have a second camera body, it's probably worth bringing, mainly from a backup redundancy standpoint. That way if something happens to your main camera, you have something to continue to shoot with. Don't go out and buy a second camera if you don't have one. But if you have one, I do believe it would be appropriate to bring it on a multi-day workshop. A lot of times on my multi-day workshops, that's where we're going to start getting into conversations about editing, workflow, things like that. So if you have a laptop available and that's what you do your editing on, bring it, because we can use it at the workshop. This is where you start to want to have a card reader, because you're going to want to pull your photos off the camera so that either I can help you work with them, put them on your laptop, or anything like that. So card readers are important. Might need more batteries, might need more memory cards, just all of that sort of thing. So that's pretty much the gear basics. Like I said, there's going to be people that have just the bare minimum, and that's fine. We're going to work with what you have and make sure you get some good photos. And maybe you're just trying to figure out which of your gear you should bring. Hopefully some of this advice would help you with that. Okay, next up, we've got clothing and comfort. Don't underestimate the importance of being comfortable out in the field. A landscape photography workshop typically means we're going to be out in early mornings when it's a little cooler, a little more damp possibly, or out in the evenings when it starts to be a little cooler. So though you may look at the weather forecast and see the highs are going to be in the low 70s, there's a good chance it's going to be in the 30s or 40s in the early morning or in the evening. And if you're out there and uncomfortable, you can't focus on your photography. You're trying to keep warm, or you're just not feeling great or something like that. So don't underestimate the value of clothing. Now, I've done videos on cold weather photography, which sort of encompasses my how to approach clothing in the form of layers. I'll link to that video down below. But really, that's what it is. It's all about the layers, layers, layers. Have a good base layer. That's something that goes against your skin, helps pull the moisture away from it. Have an insulating layer. If it's like late spring, early fall, then probably some fleece fleece or something like that's going to be just fine. And then if it's colder, you're getting a little closer to winter, or maybe it's just a cold snap, then you might get into that area where you want some down insulating layers as well. And then there's shells, sort of an overcoat or something like that, that's going to have a shell to it, which is going to give you wind protection, rain protection, and something like that. The great thing about layers is it lets you add as you need to. So if you're cold, you can add layers, and then it lets you shed as you need to. Because one of the bad things is getting too hot, starting to perspire, get wet, and it's just sort of a downward slope from there. You start to get cold, that moisture causes you to be cold, but if you have layers, you can adjust over the course of the day. Or one of the things with landscape photographers, we do some hiking, so we don't need as many layers because our body heat is keeping us warm. Then we get to a scene, and it might be on a ridge line with some wind coming in, and it starts to get cold, so we can add layers. So layers in clothing are just super important, and don't underestimate it, again, because if you're uncomfortable, you're not going to be able to focus on your photography, and you're going to be spending more time thinking about how am I going to stay warm than you are staying warm and being able to focus on the photography aspect. From there, don't forget hat and gloves. I'm a big fan of a hat. If I can keep my head warm, then I'm going to do pretty good outside. Some gloves that allow you to manipulate the camera controls with the gloves on is good, but it's also perfectly fine. Take the gloves off, manipulate camera controls, put the gloves back on. And then, of course, good shoes for your feet. Now, for me, this is hiking boots. I've always hiked in hiking boots. I like a good sturdy boot. There's others that prefer a lightweight trail runner, and they do just fine with that. It's sort of a changing feel depending on what type of hiker you are. There's nothing wrong with either. Just to go with something that your feet are comfortable in and that you have good traction and good stability with. And remember, we're going to be carrying camera bags, so if you have a camera bag on, sometimes that extra sturdiness in the shoe is going to help you with either hiking for long distance, or if you're doing some more strenuous up and down into ravines or drainages to go photograph waterfalls. So make sure you have a good quality shoe option, whether it be a hiking boot or a trail runner or something in between. Just make sure you're used to it, make sure it's broken in, and that'll help you enjoy the trip a little more. And of course, if you have questions about clothing, like I said, even if it's one of my workshops, someone else's workshop, maybe you've never been to the area, so you don't know what it's like. How fast does the temperature change? Is it a warm sun or a cold sun? Depending on the humidity, that can change how things feel. Don't hesitate to reach out to your workshop leader and ask them, hey, I'm seeing the weather looks like this. Do you think I'll be okay with that? And they'll be happy to make suggestions on bring more clothes, less clothes, and to help you be prepared. So never hesitate to reach out to your workshop leader and ask some questions. Next up, we've got logistics and planning. Even though the workshop leader probably has your trip and itinerary pretty well figured out, maybe he's made some suggestions on where to stay or has actually booked a block of rooms or something like that, they're still getting you from where you're at now to the workshop location. If you're driving, make sure your car is ready to go, full tanks of gas, download offline maps, because some of the areas I know, at least where I lead in, there's not great cell service, so you want those offline maps to figure out where you're going. So make sure you have that kind of thing prepped. If you're flying, for example, I'm doing a Death Valley workshop at the end of the year, and that'll involve a flight for me at the very least, and make sure you're prepared for that flight. Make sure you've got your gear trimmed down to be able to fly with it. You want to be able to carry your bag onto the plane, so make sure your camera bag is sized for that. Make sure you've got it packed nice, and again, make sure you have all the clothing you need and ready to go. So make sure you have a way to get your stuff there. I do have a video on tips for flying with camera gear, which I'll link to down in the description below. That will hopefully help you out. But make sure to be thinking about those things on how you're going to get from point A to point B, and that you're getting there in plenty of time so you're not feeling rushed, stressed, or anything like that. Don't forget medications, whether it be something as simple as vitamins to prescriptions or anything like that. Make sure you pack them up and bring them, because being out at a workshop where your schedule's already getting thrown off its routine, you don't want to add to that and not have a certain medication you've been taking, certain vitamin or certain routine you follow getting disrupted as well. And that can even include food and snacks. Make sure you have those with you. Like I said, a lot of times what I found is at a landscape photography workshop, those daily routines get messed up. A lot of times we're used, we'll wake up around 7:30, 8 o'clock, we'll have our morning coffee, and your body's not rocking and rolling right away. At our landscape photography workshop, a lot of times we're starting with a really early morning and we're heading out right away into the cold, we're being active. So if you're used to eating breakfast at a certain time, but we're out and about and you don't have an opportunity to eat that breakfast like you would normally, make sure you have a snack to help accommodate for that. You can eat it while we're sitting next to a stream. You can eat it on the drive there, any number of things, but make sure to bring those snacks and things like that so that you are being able to have at least some form of routine so you don't have any problems while you're out on the trails or out photographing. Water is important. Make sure you bring a water bottle, something like that. Staying hydrated is super helpful, and it's so easy to get caught up in photographing, hiking, that you forget to drink. So make sure you bring a water bottle with you. Make sure you stay hydrated. It'll just help you feel better throughout the day and keep that energy level up. So remember, be sure to bring with you what you need to take care of yourself at a workshop. It'll help you get through those routine disruptions and help you enjoy the workshop and be able to focus on the camera and on the craft of landscape photography instead of a disrupted routine causing you problems. Finally, the last tip's a little less about physical prep of gear and planning and everything like that. It's a little more of a mindset thing as you head into it, and that's be open to learning. You signed up for a landscape photography workshop because you want to learn something. So don't be afraid to ask questions at the workshop. This is your perfect time to get those questions answered. Don't worry about what other people in the workshop might think about your question. I find a lot of times someone will ask a question and someone else might be semi-familiar with the idea or the topic, but they like to hear it reinforced. Even if it's me saying something they already knew, sort of reinforces that idea or how they approach it, and they feel more confident themselves. So don't hesitate to ask questions if you're at a workshop. You're there to learn, and the workshop instructor's there to help. So be ready for that. Be ready to ask questions and don't be too shy about it. And if you're an intermediate to advanced photographer, you may find a workshop instructor teach something in a slightly different way than how you do it. And that's fine. There's a lot of times multiple different ways to do it. Let's take focus stacking. Some people prefer to manually focus stack. Some people prefer to use the automated method on their camera. I go between the two. So there may be different ways. And if you are that intermediate to advanced, it's okay to ask, hey, why do you do it that way? You know, your camera could do it automatically. Why are you doing it manual? Or why did you do it an automated way this time? Ask those questions. It's good to get the feel. It's not going to mean that the instructor's right, wrong, or that you're doing it right or wrong. You're going to learn more. You're going to get a better feel for different options, and it might change the way you do things, or it might make you even more confident that the way you're doing it is the way you want to do it. But don't be afraid to ask those questions, because there are multiple ways to do things. And asking questions about those different ways can be a great way to strengthen your own understanding. Be sure to engage with other people on your workshops. No matter the skill level, we can always learn more from each other. They can be good sounding boards. What do you think of this composition? Or what do you think of that camera? Maybe someone has a different camera than you and you're curious about it. Maybe you're the same camera brand, but they've got that lens you've been asking. Don't hesitate to ask them, hey, how do you like that lens? How do you like your camera? Or how would you approach this shot? There's so much we can learn from each other that you don't have to just get it from the instructor. A lot of the great learning moments can be from these group discussions and everybody interacting with each other about our landscape photography. So don't forget to engage with other participants on your workshop. And finally, and this tip is probably one of the more important ones here, is don't be afraid to try new things. Maybe you always photograph grand scenes, grand landscapes, and you find yourself someplace. This would be a great time to experiment with some of those smaller, more intimate scenes out in the landscape. You can try it out. You can experiment. You can get feedback right away. Hey, does this look good? Does this work? Or how should I photograph this? I'm used to photographing big scenes, which I'm great at, but how do I photograph this? Or vice versa. Maybe you do a lot of small scenes and you're going to do some grand. This is a great time to experiment and try something different. Maybe you want to try ICM, intentional camera movement. Workshop's a great place to try that. You've got someone there that can give you some feedback, help you with your shutter speed, and sort of walk you through it. So don't always look at a workshop as this is where I'm going to walk away with a ton of portfolio-worthy images. Look at it as a classroom and a place to experiment and try different things so you can get that feedback right there. You may like some of the things you try, you may not, but a workshop is a great chance to try those out. So those are the 5 essential tips I share with my workshop attendees. Like I said, while it's tailored towards my workshops, I think a lot of the advice is practical for other people going to other workshops. So if you're going to a workshop and they haven't provided a great how to get ready, you can watch this video and hopefully pick something up that's going to help you. Now I'll link to a couple videos right here that I think you might find useful for a workshop. So be sure to check those out, and thank you for watching.